So I have said that when we became aware there was a 5-hour delay, then we immediately, but as the chief of police, I immediately requested that our internal affairs, PIB unit, open a formal investigation. From the fact alone, there was a delay, and I cannot tell you the why behind that yet.
After an apparent 5-hour delay in responding to a missing child report, New Orleans authorities launched a massive search for 12-year-old Bryan Vasquez, a nonverbal, neurodivergent boy who disappeared from his home. And now, with the coroner's findings released, the investigation has taken a heartbreaking turn. And we are going to break down what happened and what investigators are facing with a retired police sergeant. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Let me tell you about a case that has gripped New Orleans over the past couple of weeks. It began as a missing child alert for 12-year-old Bryan Vasquez, a boy who was nonverbal, neurodivergent, especially vulnerable, disappeared on the morning of August 14th after he reportedly climbed out of a window in his house. And what followed was a 12-day intensive search. Drones, helicopters, cadaver dogs, even the volunteer group known as the United Cajun Navy got involved. But what happened, the outcome, it wasn't what anyone hoped for, and maybe it wasn't even what anyone could have expected. Because sadly, the newest update is heartbreaking and it is shocking, and it changes the way this entire investigation is being looked at. Questions have come up about why it took apparently 5 hours for NOPD to even begin responding after this boy was reported missing. Questions about why the family's phones were seized under a search warrant and whether investigators were appropriate in maybe looking at this family as they're now grieving. And now, with the coroner's findings in hand, police have revealed a grim truth about how Bryan died, and it is one that has sparked both outrage and sadness and has left many wondering if this tragedy could have been prevented. Now, before we get to that, I want to start at the beginning. On the morning of August 14th, 2025, 12-year-old Bryan Vasquez disappeared from his home on Beaucaire Street in New Orleans. Bryan was neurodivergent, nonverbal, didn't understand English or Spanish. His family told police that he was last seen wearing an adult diaper, believed to be wandering around on foot, and it turns out, by the way, he was last seen captured on a neighbor's doorbell footage wearing only a diaper, wandering around the street alone. By the next day, in the early hours of August 15th, Louisiana State Police issued a Level 2 Endangered Missing Child Advisory. So that meant that the state believed that Bryan's life was in danger, but that the case didn't qualify under Amber Alert criteria because investigators couldn't confirm there was an actual abduction taking place. But at 12 years old, 5'1", about 90 pounds, Bryan's disappearance sent waves of concern throughout the community. Families, neighbors, volunteers, they began searching alongside authorities. But right from the start, there was controversy. Police actually admitted that there had been a 5-hour delay between when Bryan's family reported him missing and when the New Orleans Police Department began actively searching. At a press conference, NOPD Superintendent Ann Kirkpatrick faced some pretty tough questions about that delay and other aspects of the investigation. We're going to break down in just a moment what she had to say and what that presser looked like. But for nearly 2 weeks, search teams combed through the Michaud area in New Orleans. The United Cajun Navy deployed sonar drones, 5 cadaver dogs from out of state. They alerted to a specific lagoon near Bryan's home. And then on August 26th, there was a grim and heartbreaking moment in the case, an update. Bryan's body was found in that very lagoon. It's only about 200 yards from where investigators believe he first went missing or entered that lagoon. And when authorities first recovered Bryan's body, Superintendent Kirkpatrick faced a barrage of tough questions from the press. Why was there a 5-hour delay between the time Bryan was reported missing and when officers began searching? Did a language barrier play a role? Had the police maybe given up too quickly? Well, Kirkpatrick answered each question head on, starting with the delay.
So I have said that when we became aware there was a 5-hour delay, then we immediately, but as the chief of police, I immediately requested that our Internal Affairs, PIB unit, open a formal investigation, which is why we will go back and ask all the players at hand, the sergeant, the lieutenant, the officers, the dispatch, everybody, what happened. And that's what I mean by taking facts and putting them into context to get to an answer. We want all of our community to be able to call us with confidence that we will serve you well. In this particular case, from the fact alone, there was a delay, and I cannot tell you the why behind that yet.
And Kirkpatrick confirmed that IA, Internal Affairs, is investigating what happened during that critical window. But there were questions that arose about whether law enforcement maybe also relied too heavily on volunteers, especially United Cajun Navy, who ultimately played a central role in this search. Here's what she had to say.
The Cajun Navy, as you know, are incredible volunteers, but they also, through their years, have developed an expertise in search and rescue. So we also had the LSP out there. We had a lot of different agencies with dogs, and we tried to do the search and rescue, but we also are doing an investigation. And so I thank the Cajun Navy, I thank the state police who brought helicopters, who brought drones, we brought our own drones and so forth. But that is the fact of the matter as well, that in partnership, we all kind of lean toward our expertise, and search and rescue many times are more of an expertise of different units. In this case, we're fortunate in the state of Louisiana to have volunteers, the Cajun Navy, who also have some instrumentality that we don't always have. They had sonar, so I understand it, sonar drone. Our drones are not sonar.
And the press also focused on whether language barriers could have contributed to this delay as well. While Kirkpatrick didn't rule it out, emphasized that the investigation is going to examine all factors that may have been at play here. And when it came to Bryan himself, she revealed he had a history of wandering off, but also seemed to hint at concerns surrounding the family too.
Let me speak to the fact that I know of I know of one other event in which Bryan, within the last month, had left home and was discovered unaccompanied. And so we do know that. And so wandering would not be unusual either for a special needs child. However, you know, how many times in the history that we will be looking at? Is there more than a few incidences? And so history matters. And then, Chris, you asked me specifically, what was your second question?
If the mother has faced any previous allegations or has been under investigation before?
The answer is yes.
Now, she didn't elaborate any further on that. And by the end of that first briefing, the NOPD labeled Bryan's case an unclassified death investigation, meaning they weren't yet calling it a homicide, but they weren't ruling anything out either. And then just one day later, August 27th, Superintendent Kirkpatrick stood before cameras once again with the Orleans Parish Coroner's findings. So we're going to get into all that, but first, to help me break down what we've heard so far, I want to bring on a special guest. I want to bring on retired police sergeant Troy Hillman. Troy, thank you so much for coming on. I want to take this piece by piece. First of all, what are the initial steps that an investigator takes when a missing child report comes in? How critical are those first few hours?
It actually comes down to minutes on those kind of calls. There really should be what we would call, and my jurisdiction was a priority one, which is a kind of an emergency call. And it all depends on the circumstances. But in this particular case, you had a disabled child that was nonverbal that had just been missing at that point for a while. So it's just a bad situation, and an agency just needs to jump on it ASAP.
Now, talking the law here, we're talking a lot about it. You know who are experts in the law? Morgan & Morgan, okay, our amazing sponsor, America's largest injury law firm. This is a firm with over 1,000 attorneys. You know why they have so many? Because they win a lot. They have recovered over $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. Think about that. In the past few months, a client in Florida received $12 million after the insurance company offered just $350,000. Out in Pennsylvania, a client was awarded $26 million. That is 40 times the insurer's $650,000 offer. Another client in Pennsylvania received $29 million. That's after being offered only $500,000. Now look, even if you don't think your case is worth millions of dollars, why not just start a claim and fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so simple. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code on screen. Let's break that down for a second. Why is it such a concern? What are the possible consequences of a purported 5-hour delay in responding to a missing child report, if it's true? And what could be a benign explanation for why that would have happened?
I think it really, every minute that goes by is a potential for that child to be abducted, to run into traffic, to go into a lagoon, things like that. So I think time is of the essence. But it's counterbalanced with the fact that most agencies are short-staffed. The police, have not been able to keep up with retirements, so you have a staffing issue. So I don't know all the details as to why this was not basically treated as an emergency call or why the delay. But to me, there was the definitive gap and some holes in that.
You mentioned this before. The truth is, Bryan was a vulnerable individual and a different kind of individual in terms of a missing persons report, right? So if you are encountered with a situation where you're looking for someone like Bryan, what are the specific methods, the specific tools that you might have deployed that are a bit different than a missing person case involving someone else?
I think you need to look at history as to where it sounded like he had left the home before. There had been some incidents to figure out where he went then. He may have retraced his steps. And then try to get the community involved as quick as possible to be looking for this child via the media, whatnot.
And one of the things about missing persons cases is law enforcement, they rely on the public. The public can help in so many different ways. People online, volunteer groups. If you see something, report it. Extra manpower, it's great. Having said that, when you have a case, let's say, for example, with the Cajun Navy, when they're involved, from a law enforcement perspective, how do professionals balance volunteer involvement with formal investigative procedures? Are there risks in relying on volunteer groups, even if they have a specialization, even if they have a professional aspect to it? Is there a risk? Is there a benefit? How do you balance it?
And typically, those volunteer organizations have maybe people at the top that have been prior law enforcement or have been heavily involved and experienced. So they, I can't speak to the exact training, but it appeared that we need as much all hands on deck. Law enforcement needs help. Something's better than nothing. But yeah, there could be stuff that gets missed. We're all human. We don't know what was relayed from the person who made the call to the person taking the call. There's a lot of unknowns here in this overall overarching investigation.
But it helps. It helps to have volunteer groups. They can maybe add something or provide something that law enforcement may not have. Sure, law enforcement, right, has to corroborate it. They have to make sure the information is accurate, but you can have volunteer groups that maybe aid law enforcement in a way law enforcement can't do themselves, right? You talked about understaffing.
Absolutely. We had reserve officers, people maybe wanted to get involved with the police department, but own their own business or whatnot and just wanted to help. But they would go through an academy, much like the traditional police officer academy, and then they would serve so many hours. So there are opportunities for volunteers, and a lot of people getting into it, their background checked. So you know they're typically safe. And again, agencies need help, dramatically understaffed.
Before I get into what law enforcement say happened to Bryan, and we'll get into that in a second because that was a shocking revelation. Before we get into that, generally speaking, how do investigators determine when a death is, quote, unclassified, right, versus a homicide or accident? What does that mean? And what factors influence that decision? And then we'll get into what they say happened to Bryan.
Well, I think the initial investigation, when officers and or detectives arrive, and then later on, we had it, the medical examiner would arrive, you'd pretty much know visually or by witness statements, surveillance video, what was at the scene, kind of what happened. So there's this other classification, and I believe they call it unclassified death, or what we call death unknown, which kind of until we're able to get it in the hands of a medical examiner to say for sure, if there's no outward trauma to this, in this case, this child, then you have to look towards science, and you have to look towards the medical examiner, coroner, to basically determine what injuries caused this individual's death.
And let's talk about it. Okay, let's go to the coroner's findings. August 27th, Superintendent Kirkpatrick revealed the coroner's findings, and these words were very difficult to hear, and they were incredibly heavy.
The coroner has determined that 12-year-old Bryan Vasquez died from blunt force due to an alligator and then subsequently drowned. We know that these are difficult outcomes, and we still have quite a grieving community and a grieving family. This investigation does continue. However, this afternoon, I did formally request that the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries eradicate nuisance alligators. That will begin this afternoon. And so we want the community in the Michoud neighborhood to be aware that we will have hunters in that body of water eradicating these nuisance alligators. We will have an NOPD presence just to make sure that people understood what was going on. I want to thank our Special Victims Division, and you know Chief Gernon to my right is the Chief over Investigations, as well as the Chief to my left shoulder, the Chief over Field Operations. This is a continuing investigation. It is not over.
So, wildlife fisheries, they have already begun removing what Kirkpatrick called nuisance alligators from the lagoon, but alongside grief, there are so many unanswered questions in this case. When exactly did Bryan die? Well, according to Kirkpatrick, the coroner couldn't determine whether this attack occurred the same day that he went missing, August 14th. Why the delay? Well, this was brought up again. Kirkpatrick called the 5-hour gap inordinate and admitted it may have cost precious time. What about DCFS, right? Department of Children and Family Services. The department has opened its own investigation. There are no details that have been released at this time. So Troy, let's talk about it. My gosh, shocking conclusion here about an alligator attack. Let's start right there. What do you make of that?
It's horrific. We unfortunately live in amongst nature, and some things tragic happen, and it, possibly the child walked too close, and then that's where he was attacked. And then there's so many variables to whether or not, and I'm not an expert as to how far an alligator would typically bite somebody and take them into waters and then release. So there's so many issues that people with experts can basically begin to unravel and figure out kind of that timeline, and I think that's important. But yeah, there's just a lot that goes into this, breaking it apart and saying, okay, what could we have done better as law enforcement? What could we have done better as a community, and kind of isolate on that. And then keep in mind that the family is grieving and going through a really rough time. But in missing person cases, typically there was some backlash on whether or not the agency should, look at the family. Unfortunately, you have to look at every angle in an objective manner on these type of things, especially with children, to look at who potentially could have been involved, knowing what you know at the moment.
This is something that I mentioned before. Authorities, they issued a search warrant on the cell phones that they say belong to this family, to Bryan's family. And the family told WWL-TV they felt they were being harassed. Police say it's standard practice, though. I mean, you do have to get approval from a judge, right? You have to get a warrant. How should we be thinking about this? Is it standard practice? Was it wrong in this case? And again, right, you need to have enough evidence to have a judge to sign off on this.
Well, I've always gone just in my personal life and kind of what I saw during my career as if you have nothing to hide, then just turn everything over in full disclosure and help the agency investigate. Yeah, and yes, a judge would have to sign off on that. So there would be a burden of proof for the agency to go and say, we need this person's cell phone, and here's why. They would have to put that in an affidavit and a judge. So there are checks and balances. Uh, in this kind of situation, you've got a vulnerable missing child. You're just looking at everything, and unfortunately, we've had some situations where parents have hurt their children. So as a society, agencies have to look at everything, and that includes the parents and the family. And it is hurting. It's kind of that, it's awful because it hurts them and they're going through grieving, but at the same time, it is standard practice.
And to be clear, there's been no arrests. There's been no charges. The NOPD continues to classify Bryan's death as this unclassified death. And we still don't have a lot of answers, right? So the idea that the coroner can't at this point in time determine the exact time of death, could that change? Is that unusual? What should we be taking away from that?
I know from my experience and talking to medical examiners, coroners before, it is sometimes difficult to determine especially when a body is submerged in water. There's a lot of factors that go into that, heat related kind of things, scientific. So that may be something that gets maybe pushed further to more experts, maybe at a state or federal level that could ascertain how long, but sometimes it is just a window of time. But usually they can narrow it down pretty much days, I would think.
Yeah, it's one of the chilling aspects of it because we're trying to piece together the final moments of his life. And then you have DCFS, right? So they have opened this investigation alongside the police. A, how do the two agencies coordinate without compromising an investigation? And B, what do you think they're looking for? Is it the idea if Bryan had gone off before, how is this, why wasn't it prevented from happening? I'm not really sure. What do you think they're looking at?
Well, I think DCFS, if I'm pronouncing that right, has a responsibility for the children and to protect children. And so if there's been incidents in the past where Bryan had escaped through, they mentioned something about the door was locked and he was in there with a sibling. But if he had escaped and in the middle of the night out a window, maybe there's a responsibility there to secure that window, so that maybe some type of tamper resistant or childproof lock on it to make sure that he can't really escape. But again, things happen, so you have to counterbalance that with um, kids do things in a heartbeat and parents do the best they can. So the parents were probably sleeping. So it's tough. You have to look at it objectively. You put together a report. You share that with the investigators for the police department. And then that'll probably be chaperoned over to the district or county attorney for a ruling whether there was negligence. And I know that so there's so many issues, when you look at that and then you look at was there negligence on the part of the police department for not getting an officer out there sooner. So and again, I'm not here to point fingers. You just have to, that's all going to be sorted out by the different levels of probably the prosecutors.
And to be clear, we're not even suggesting that's something that will be found. There could be no one at fault for this. This could just be a tragic series of events that happened here. But it is interesting, based on the reporting about whatever internal investigation is happening with law enforcement, to talk about this 5-hour gap, this purported 5-hour gap, why DCFS is reportedly getting involved, what they may do. I will say the city has since issued a statement in remembrance of Bryan, and it reads in part, Bryan was a bright, charismatic, and energetic young boy whose joy and spirit touched the lives of his family, friends, and community. Bryan's memory will forever remain in the hearts of those who loved him, and his light will continue to shine as a reminder of resilience, innocence, and love. And there is a GoFundMe that has been set up to help the family cover funeral expenses, legal costs, and at the time of this recording, that family has raised $10,000 toward their goal. Pretty unbelievable.
Yeah.
Troy, thank you so much for taking the time. I know this is a really difficult case. I know we're still trying to piece together everything that we can, but appreciate your expertise on this as we continue to cover it.
Absolutely happy to help, and thank you for having me on.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.